Hello, everyone. It's Wednesday, and I hope your day is well. Glad you've tuned in to think as we look at Holy Week, mere days from Easter, a very, very different Easter week than any of us have experienced, obviously. It's strange being in the building when there's no effort being made to get ready for Sunday, and all that we are usually doing to get ready for Easter simply isn't happening, at least in the building. What I do hope is what can be happening in all of us leading up to Easter is happening, and that is that we are taking time to think about this week and what this week points to and what this week means leading up to Sunday. Good Friday is a handful of days away. I plan to have something on here for noon on Good Friday as well. But I wanted to follow up on Sunday and the role of choices in the crucifixion of Jesus. There's no way to diminish the work of God on behalf of us through Christ on the cross to bring forgiveness for us. The great initiative of God, and that God so loved the world, that God is moved by this great agape love, this pity, this charity, this kindness, this long-suffering. He who is realistic about us and cares for us with the care that we need, not the care that we deserve or even know to ask for. That is a great story of the crucifixion of Jesus and Easter. It's the best part of it. It is 99% of it for me. And yet the goodness of God does compete in the story with the great failure of the humans that surrounded Jesus. And of course, one reason we know these humans failed is the humans who failed didn't hide the stories. We know so much about how disciples failed because disciples knew how they failed and didn't bury the story. Other disciples knew, and the stories were told and retold as a part of the story of Christ. And so they're very beneficial to us to see these great people who will become even greater. We know them at times of great fractured weakness. They're not at their best. They make choices that they'll really come to regret. But I bring this up because we're in a time in society, in the history of the world, when we are overwhelmed with choices. There's so many choices we can make in a life. And yet my experience is that people feel, by and large, powerless. They feel so powerless in so many places in life, and yet they're overwhelmed with the choices they can make in life. So choices doesn't correspond to a sense of personal freedom, personal decision, and personal power. But the death of Jesus reminds us that choices are real, and we can make choices that have far-reaching consequences. And that is the way we should think about life. So I want to read to you from Luke 23:18. With one voice, the crowd, with one voice they cried out, "Away with this man, Jesus. Release Barabbas to us." And then verse 19 says, Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. And wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And we know how the story goes on, this play back and forth between Pilate, who wants to release Jesus, and the crowd who wants Barabbas released instead. It's important to note that even though the crowd speaks with one voice for the crucifixion of Jesus, they're not speaking as one person. It's person upon person upon person upon person that is making up this one voice, this one call for Barabbas to be released and Christ to be crucified. And yet there was one person who could override the one voice, and that's Pilate. So he's hearing one voice, when in fact the one voice is many, 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 many voices. But the one voice, Pilate's, is the one who could still all the voices. None of this has to occur like it occurs. And so there is that mix that God was doing a work in Christ crucified, and yet those who failed truly did fail. People and persons are prominent in the story. Judas makes a real decision, maybe 100 small decisions that create the logic that leads him to betray Jesus. Peter makes decisions, 3 of them that night, 3 decisions to deny that he knows Jesus. The 12 as a whole are making decisions about what they'll do with Christ, following Christ, and then when the pressure gets too much, how they will save themselves to get away. The leaders in Jerusalem, Pilate, and not to mention all the countless nameless people who have had contact with Jesus through these 3 years and have decided what to do with what he said, and if it means anything. So the crucifixion comes about by choices. God, yes. People, yes. But it's our reminder that we're not powerless. We really do have the capacity to turn things the wrong way. We really do have the capacity to be an enemy of God and God's wishes for the world. We really do have the capacity to hurt people and to spread evil and to spread harm. We're really not powerless in how evil unfolds in the world and how events like the crucifixion unfold. There are many, many ways to fail by our decisions, and that should make us slow down and be as intentional as possible with what we do, with how we do it, with what we buy, with what we say, with where we go. There's so many, many ways our decisions are shaping the way a day unfolds in a small town, how it unfolds in your house, the conversations we have one with another. I have had people in my office through the years who describe the shape of their marriage and who speak about the shape of their marriage as something outside of their control, when in fact, if they would just change the way they spoke to one another, it would change their marriage immediately. If they changed the way they thought about each other, it would change their marriage immediately. If they changed the way they treated one another, it would change their marriage immediately. Their marriage isn't something that got lost because it went someplace else. It's gotten lost by a handful of really poor behaviors and by their willingness to welcome certain words into their house and certain words they use for one another. It's not complex. Now, it's emotional, and it's often coming from the subconscious. It's often coming from homes and childhoods. Nobody's just operating out of one simple motive. That's true. But they are making decisions about how they talk to one another, how they talk about their children, how they talk about the future, how they spend money. All of those things have a role to play, and if they would stop those things, certain consequences stop. That's the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. This thing could have been stopped. There were decisions that weren't made, and so it never was stopped, and it could have been stopped at any point. And we talk about that because the scripture's real, that the betrayal of Jesus by Judas was a true betrayal. And so we've got to keep in mind that decisions do matter. Choices are taking us places. And so even though we feel powerless, we're not. And the backside of that is that our decisions can often really hurt people. And failing God, failing people, that doesn't just land in a field that no one goes to and no one's heard of. It lands. And the world has changed, and you are changed. And so we pay close attention to decisions and the weight of decisions. That is part of this story at Easter, the crucifixion of Christ and the failure of disciples, the failure of Pilate, the failure of anyone. But if I can turn it around a little bit today, more optimistic, it's worth remembering that there is the other side of this coin, and that is decisions we make that are decisions based on faithfulness to Christ. Those are consequential too. We're not powerless in that regard either. We really can make decisions by faith, motivated by love, motivated by kindness, intentional works of our lives, long walks, long promises, just making a commitment to an ending that might be really far away, and we might not even be around to see how it ends. But we're making a commitment and making a promise to get someplace. And so imagine this, that there are two stories of failure in the ending of Jesus' life. One of them is Judas, and one of them is Peter. They both fail Jesus. Judas fails him by betraying him. Peter fails him by denying him. What is remarkable about both is they both had to be close enough to Jesus to fail Jesus in the unique way they failed him. So Judas can betray him by a kiss because he's a close enough friend with Jesus that giving him the greeting of a kiss would not have been odd. The other disciples didn't stop him. Jesus didn't stop him. No one would have stopped him because this is how close friends greeted one another. You can only betray Jesus with a kiss if you're his friend. And so he's close enough to betray him. Peter's close enough to fail him. He's close enough to promise time upon time that he would be faithful. They can only fail him as they did uniquely because they were close enough to him. So these are true failures of friendship. The distinction is, when it's all said and done, they both suffer great remorse and great grief. Judas feels the grief and failures enough that life doesn't have a future. And it doesn't for Judas. But that's his decision. Peter, on the other hand, sticks around. And we'll see that great story in the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus will ask Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter 3 times gets to say yes. Of course, corresponding to the 3 times that he denied him. There was a future. And Peter made a decision to stick around. Peter made a decision to seek forgiveness. That was a big decision. But he had a choice. So you want to keep in mind that this idea of choice and decisions, you and I will face personal failures. Big personal failures. Some of them people know about, some of them people won't. Peter got it right. He reconciled with Jesus. And he discovered that the forgiveness Jesus came to bring us was a forgiveness that was there for him as well. It's a wonderful story. But you and I have decisions to make on the other side of our own personal failures. Plenty of people who were at the event of the crucifixion of Jesus likely also suffered remorse for being a part of it. They had to make a decision on what to do. Our decision always on the backside of a personal failure is to seek forgiveness from God. It's a powerful decision. Not hiding from it, not denying it, but instead accepting the failure. And sometimes it also means that we seek reconciliation with those whom we failed. We seek forgiveness. We apologize. It is the case that as we reach adulthood, we feel rightly that we owe our parents about 1,000 apologies because we just didn't understand what was going on in us, in them, in our homes, the many, many pressures. We just weren't helpful to the adults trying to figure out how to be adults and live their life while they're raising us. And we just didn't realize what was going on and how hard it was. So it's not bad to apologize to parents when we're kids, but even when we're adults, for not understanding and not being the help we could have been. But there's also a place for parents to apologize to children, to tell kids where we got it wrong, especially close to the time we got it wrong. That we knock on doors and we call kids out and we reconcile with kids and say, I overreacted. Parenting is a frightening place, and a lot of what our kids do scares us. And we overreact. And we can apologize to our kids. We can apologize for getting things wrong. We can apologize for how we speak, how we behave. But these have huge impacts. And I would tell you, as one who listens and has listened to a lot of people speak throughout the years, people can make sense of people they love who make mistakes, who fail them, but then apologize and seek reconciliation for it. They can make sense of those stories. What they can usually not make sense of is really bad behavior and no one talks about it. Really bad behavior and nobody seeks forgiveness. Really bad behavior and nobody apologizes. Those are really difficult places for humans as a rule. That they fail, but they don't seek reconciliation. So I would tell you, you might think that the world ends by something you've done wrong. I'm telling you, a new world opens on the other side of you doing something wrong if you make a decision to do something really strong with it. And that is to identify where you failed someone, to call it what it was, to name it for what it was, to point out why it was a failing and why it hurt someone, and to point out what you're going to do to be better about this, how you're going to change, and to actually ask someone if he or she can forgive you. That's a very humbling place to be, but there are few things more powerful than seeking reconciliation when you've sinned. It's enormous. To seek forgiveness of God when you've sinned. To seek forgiveness with a brother or sister when you've sinned. These are enormous, powerful places where you You call a failure what it is. You call sin what it is. You call brokenness what it is. You call your fracturedness what it is. You are serious about failing. It's a powerful, powerful place to seek forgiveness. But there's also the other side, the unique side Jesus was living when he is going to be among those after the fact who had failed him. You talk about a sheepish group of men who are going to gather with Jesus. On the other side of this story, when resurrection has occurred, you would think you'd most like to see Jesus after you failed them, and yet you would think that's the last person you want to see is the one who saw you failing him. But people are going to fail you. And that is a very powerful place. That is, there are people who have failed you, and you know the power you hold over them. You can not only know the story of their failure, you can keep the story alive. And you can create pain for them unending. You can tell no few people how somebody failed you. It's a very powerful place to be on the receiving end of a personal failure. You can do a lot with it. You can do a lot with it for a long time. And people who have been wronged often don't let their children forget how their father wronged them, how their mother wronged them, how grandparents wronged them, how neighbors wronged them. You know, when we're raising children, we have that great temptation to explain our lives through the failure of the people around us. And good luck if you don't do it. Grace on you if you don't do it. I was certainly guilty of it. And it just wasn't necessary. The temptation still exists today. For me, for you, we see the sins and wrongs of people. It's hard not to hold it against them. And yet the truth is, we can make decisions on the other side of people failing us that can be powerful. Colossians 3:13 says we should forgive as in Christ Jesus we've been forgiven. There are few things more liberating and powerful than forgiving someone of a sin. It's nice to think that everybody would come to you and seek forgiveness, but they don't. It's nice to think that people might know when they've offended you. They often don't know they have. It's nice to think that they know how deeply they hurt you. They often don't. So much of forgiveness is not forgiving those who come and seek it. It's forgiving those who don't even know they've hurt you. You know, releasing people from all the ways they've disappointed you, releasing people from the ways they've failed you, releasing people from all the versions of them you wish they'd been for you, that's a very liberating place personally, to just be free of that. But it's also the only way to live close to another human, is to release them from all the ways they have failed you, to forgive them. There's a book I use in my class that's called The Sunflower. It's by Simon Wiesenthal. It's something I look forward to every semester. And the book explores the limits of forgiveness. It's set in a Nazi prison camp, and a Jewish man is called in to speak to a dying German soldier who wants to speak to a Jew, any Jew. And in a sense, what happens is he confesses his sins, his role in the deaths of some 300 Jewish families. 300 Jewish peoples, families. And what he's after is the forgiveness of Simon Wiesenthal, the author. And so by the end, of the memoir, at the end, he asked the question, what would you have done if you'd been standing in my shoes, a Jew in a prison camp called to a dying German? And he's asking you, in a sense, to forgive him for what he's done. What would you have done? And 2/3 of the book are outside authors responding to that question. And I have my students answer that question. What would you have done? And so what happens in the papers is my students do wonderful things with this, but I ask them to use the paper to give me a rationale for how they're dealing with humans that fail them. If you've not experienced it yet, I tell them, you will. It's good to have a plan going in for how you're going to deal with humans who fail you. And the papers for me are so inspiring, because about 2/3 of the students have already had some hard stories of adults who have failed them, or brothers or sisters who have failed them. And what they do in response to it is so often, again, I use the word inspiring. They work hard to make peace with their parents. They work hard to live between divorced parents and find a way to make peace with both of them. To forgive adults who have failed them, to forgive friends who have failed them. They're really hard stories. But what I like about it, and what I see so uplifting about it, is that they are creating a future. Every day they are going in on the backside of someone failing them, in that dark, murky place where this could simply be a baseball bat that they could use on this person forever. They instead are finding a way to reconcile. I especially enjoy the Christian kids who don't even struggle. They just say, I've been forgiven. I've got to find a way to forgive. And they find a way to forgive. And that's such a great, great life skill already at that young age. You and I have people who feel like enemies. And it's up to us to find a way forward with them. When Jesus says in Matthew 5:43, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I tell you, love, that is agape, that is, be charitable, be long-suffering. Love as God loves them. Don't lose their humanity. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Few things are more consequential than viewing opponents and enemies in this way. We'll have them. At least we'll have people who feel like them. But we're not powerless in the face of opponents or in the face of enemies, in the face of people who believe things way beyond what we believe, even people who believe things that we feel to be tragic and wrong and untrue and catastrophic if carried out. There still is this call to turn toward people, to be consequential in how you think about them, be consequential in how you respond to them. And so we're called to pray for them. We're called to not lose their humanity in the midst of this. Because the truth is, if you lose their humanity in your anger, you're likely next to lose your own. We all have choices. There were people who fully believed that Jesus was the greatest threat to that day and time. They truly believed that. And they acted in that motive. There are people we might believe are enemies and the greatest threat. But it matters how we respond to them. We're not powerless. In fact, we maybe never show more power than how we respond to enemies. So I encourage you to think about how you're responding to your failures, and how you're responding to how people fail you. These are places where we can make choices, and they are powerful choices. To reconcile with enemies, to reconcile with those who failed you, to seek reconciliation with people you failed. These are powerful decisions that are worth considering. And I hope you'll consider them today as we consider the crucifixion of Christ, the forgiveness God was bringing to us. I hope you're well. Hope you're exercising. Hope you're getting out of the house. Hope you're eating better than I am. But I hope you're hopeful and upbeat as we go through this week.